Thank you. Thanks. Bless you. Bless you all. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. You make me feel special. And I'm really nervous. And so I was thinking today, and actually yesterday, how can I lower my expectations and the people's expectations because I'm really rusty? And so I was thinking sports metaphors. They say I told you I was rusty. And one that came to my mind is this kind of like a preseason game. And if you've ever gone to a preseason game at the Broncos, you will know that it's cheaper to get in at the Broncos during preseason because they know that the product that they're putting on the field is not as good as the regular season. So I figured this, that since I am rusty, and every time I speak for the next month, when you come, and those of you that give, should only have to give 9%. Now, that doesn't count when Paul and Shalane talk because they're still up to speed, so still the 10% there. And I checked it out with the Lord, and he kind of agreed that he saw the rust too, and actually thought maybe 6% was better. So anyhow, you notice when I'm making this announcement after you've already given. And I can see some of you going back to the booth now and say, I want my 2% back. So anyway, vision, 2007. I want us to think about the enormous amount of change that has invaded our lives in the last 25 years. And I'm going to give you two examples of this. My nephew, who is now, 34 or 35 years old, but when he was first starting out, came to my father, who was alive in those days, and said, Granddad, I have bought CDs. And my dad said, I am so impressed, Lincoln, that you would buy CDs. And of course, going through his mind were certificates of deposit. He did not know that he was talking about the CDs that you put in your stereo. And then, of course, my nephew had to say, well, Granddad, we're probably not talking on the same wavelength. So there was just a change in things that happen in our society today that we just really have to get a hold of, how quickly they're taking place. I looked this up this week on the internet about people and technology and the terms, and this one lady called in, she had heard about Windows 95. And so she called the tech and said, I'd like to buy Windows 95, but I wanted to know if I could just buy one window. And he tried to explain to her that, no, it's the year 95, but anyhow, you lose it all there. From the internet to the amount of technology each one of us use daily in our lives that we didn't hear about a decade ago, there's just so much coming at us. This technology or modernization has impacted our lives, and the onslaught of new ways of doing business never seems to stop. It just continues to come. I had lunch with a man this week. He'll be here tomorrow at the hospital, and he works up at the hospital. And he was telling me that he was invited into his boss's office, and the boss told him, says, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you. The bad news is you're fired. The good news is you're rehired. And what's going to happen to you is that you're going to have the same job, you're going to work in the same office, you're going to do the same duties, but you no longer work for St. Mary's Hospital. As a matter of fact, you work for this different company. And your boss is going to be in Dallas, and he informed me at that particular time the only way that he has met his boss is through email. But he did get a 10% increase in his salary. And so they asked him, would you like to take the job? And he thought there for a minute, yeah, I guess I will, for 10%, but I don't know really what happened to me. And that seems to be what has taken place in our society today, is that you can have such things taking place in your life because of technology that we really wonder what's going on in our lives. It seems as though we battle in our lives just to keep some form of control, to maintain some sense of consistency or normalcy. Cheryl read an article to me the other day in the newspaper, and it was about the amount of subscribers that continue to fall off every year out of newspapers. The problem is people are receiving their news from different sources. You've got the internet, you've got 24-hour news channel. I don't know about you, but lots of times, and there's nothing against the Daily Sentinel, so if you work at the Daily Sentinel, but when you get up in the morning and you read the Daily Sentinel, it's like old news from the night before. And it's becoming so quick. So the subscribership of all newspapers continue to dwindle because people are finding their sources of news in a new way. So, editors and owners of these newspapers are trying to get together and figure out how do we stay up with the times, no pun intended, New York Times, but how do we stay up with the times so that we don't become a relic of the past? And it's not just in, the newspaper business. It's in every business that you can go to today that there is a modernization that's taking place, that it really is difficult for people to stay in touch with what's going on in the world because of the changes that are coming so quickly. There are many complaints about the church. The sad part about this, friends, is the church is caught in this same dynamic. Overall attendance in the church continues to plummet. Now, obviously, we don't have that problem, and thank God for it. But I want you to know that statistically, and please don't take this out of context, but it's really true, that lots of times what people report on surveys in church is not necessarily totally the truth, especially about attendance and how often they really do attend. And not that I'm harping on that, but I just want you to understand this, that if you would take in our community, for instance, if we're at 130,000 people now, that if you have 20,000 people a weekend in church, we would be lucky. And friends, that's not just here in the Midwest. This is pretty much nationwide. And the statistics I see is that you continually watch a drop in church. And so there is this type of feeling amongst church people, and especially leaders, of how do we gather people back into the church? How do we contend with all that is going on in our society? The church used to enjoy a place of respect within the community and one of the major voices. Today, it's one of many voices with a growing population of unchurched people that don't even know about the church or its mission. They almost think like, what is it, these buildings with a cross on it? They don't get it. Then we have other dynamics that are affecting the church, such as a rise of individualism and relativism. This attitude mainly states that I can find my own truth, and the church is something that has been constructed by humans to control individual freedom. And here's a point, friends, that all of us have to ask at some point in our lives. How much do I want to involve myself in community? And when I do involve myself in community, how much do I give of my individual freedom? And the opposite is true, too. If I go too far in individualism, then how much do I give in community? And that's where a lot of people are lonely today, is because they've opted out for the individualism over community. So we have people who are exiting the church because they want more independence in their lives and in their faith. This is not new to the church or even to church history. The writer of Hebrews, now think about this. The New Testament church, everybody goes, we want to be a New Testament church. They were dealing with the same issues that you and I are dealing with today. And that's why the writer of Hebrews comes back and says to whoever it was that he was writing to, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together as some is in the habit of doing. You see, and so it's a problem that was going on way back then. So just like other businesses who are trying to find their way through the maze of change, the church is also trying to find its way. And you feel the struggle, you feel the tension in it. The question comes, how do we move the church out of the 20th century and into the 21st century without compromising the substance or the message? Well, I made it through the introduction. If you have your little outlines, let's take a look at 5 points to ponder about our future. 5 points to ponder about our future. Number one is this, pursue the Acts 2:42-47 church model. I want us to read this together, okay? And I really want you to speak it out as we read it together. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Possessions and goods are doing well. They gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. What the New Testament church experience was born out of freshness or new beginnings. There are major pillars established when something new begins, and those pillars or principles need to be practiced continually. The problem is, how do we keep it fresh? That's the big question. There were 5 principles in the New Testament church that we have adopted as our 5 purposes here at the Vineyard. Number 1 is this: discipleship. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now listen, friends, I want you to understand this here tonight. When I am talking about discipleship, I am not talking just in the context of when somebody stands up in front of you and teaches is the way that you get discipled, but it is one of the ways. As a matter of fact, when you think about discipleship, it is such a subjective opinion about yourself to even ask the question, am I growing? And then in the context of those times of knowing that there's ebbs and flows in whatever the Spirit of God is doing in you, where you find yourself feeling more distant from God than what you used to. And so when we talk about discipleship, it is something that I'm asking you and I'm asking myself, am I drawing closer to the Lord? And only you can really answer that. But it is something that is a dynamic that is released throughout all the Scriptures that God wants His children to grow in the grace and the knowledge of who He is. The second one is this: fellowship. They were meeting together in small groups. They went from house to house breaking bread. Now, friends, I think most of us in this room at one time or another, whether it's been in the church or out of the church, have probably experienced the whole dynamic of small groups. And I think sometimes what happens to us in the church is that our small groups become way too churchy and way too sterile. I'll try it on this side of the room. And all I'm talking about this is that it seems like when they got together, they ate together and had a good time. And that doesn't mean that we're not supposed to, but it does mean this, is that, it's kind of like what Paul says in Romans, that they wept together and then they rejoiced together. And there's times, because that's just the rhythm of life. You go through issues in life, and then you find out you're grieving with somebody, and then you just really have good times together. And we just need to celebrate the good times. Fellowship, friends, goes beyond talking about what the Broncos or the Raiders did last week or year. And I, for one, do not want Ronnie praying for the Broncos. I love him, but I know how he's praying, okay? Number 3 is mission. Many were being added to their number daily, and I'm going to be saying more about this in just a minute, friends, because I have a theory about this. The Bible doesn't make explanation as to how it happened, but I believe it happened because they had relationships with people that were outside of the community. So that you have a mission out into the world, and I'm going to say a lot more about that in just a minute. Then they had a ministry. They were reaching into the church, ministry into the church. They were selling whatever they had to sell, and they were contributing to the needs of the saints, and they were taking care of one another. And their time, talent, resources, energies, and all that kind of stuff were putting back into the church as well as reaching out. And then they did this, all in the context of number 5 is worship. There was a sense of awe of what God was doing. And see something fresh that was upon the church, and they were practicing all these things, and it came out, and there was wonderful things that were taking place, and God was all on everything that was going on. But now I want you to notice this, and you can go home and study it because I don't have time to develop the whole thing for you, but go to Acts chapter 6. Here's a great ingathering. I even read some statistics this week. It was like 50 to 100,000 people that came to the Lord during this time. So you talk about church growth. And so some of you here that really don't like big churches, you're in big problem. Because when you get to heaven, that's all there's going to be is one big church. So big that nobody can put numbers to it. But the idea of it is that there was a sense of awe that was going on. And then you get to Acts chapter 6 and you'll find out that this begins to take place. There were complaints that began to arise. See, everything doesn't stay just fresh as a daisy. So churches go through ebbs and flows. There's times of great ingathering, and then you'll find out that there was an administrative move that was made there by the apostles to restructure the church to handle it. And then it says after the restructuring, and this is the time that Stephen was appointed as a deacon, and the church expanded even more. And then you find out that it goes through more troubles. And that's just the way life is. But these are the 5 principles, and that is what's before us, and that's what we want to pursue with freshness. Number 2 is this. Strive to be an intergenerational church. Strive to be an intergenerational church. There's something so healthy about different generations meeting in the same place, isn't there? Absolutely. There is something so filled with tension with different generations meeting in the same place. Isn't that the truth? I mean, every generation has its own characteristics. It has its own likes, it has its own dislikes. It has its own sense of humor, it has its own sense of music, it has its own sense of what it likes in the way of dress. And every generation is different. I notice, because my kids were just home for Christmas, and when they come into the home, they take over the music. They don't ask us. They just take over. And there's strange sounds that come out of my nice stereo system that I'm not accustomed to. And there's points when I ask, can we play something that I know? You know? And so the idea of it is this, is that when all of us get in a car, there's 6 of us. 6 of us can have different opinions of the kind of music that we want to listen to. And all it is generational. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just different. And that's the way it is in the church too, friends, is that we have different generations. I want to talk about these generations for just a moment. Number 1 is this, is we have the builders, which is my mom and dad's generation. That generation, the greatest generation ever, as Tom Brokaw calls them, which I happen to agree. They fought in World War II, went through the Great Depression, and came out on the other side with the big band era and did the jitterbug. Now, some of you think I just introduced a new type of insect. That is not true. It's a dance called the jitterbug, and these people are just wonderful people, and we have seniors, and they have their distinct characteristics about them, and we love you. And we need you. And you're supposed to be a part of this church. And then we have, behind that, my generation, which is called the boomers. Because after all these people came from war, now they wanted to have peace and love. And so all these kids start showing up, you know, and it's called the baby boom generation, and it's the largest generation in the history of man. We are so big, we are like the pig and the python. And you know what that does? When a python, this is an ugly illustration, I hate snakes and all the rest of it, but when they constrict and kill the pig and then they begin to swallow it, you can see the form of the pig inside of the python. It's pretty ugly, isn't it? But it changes the whole structure of the python. You see what they're trying to get across here? So when the baby boom generation comes through, it just changes everything simply because of the size of it. The largest group of people that I am talking tonight, friends, are the boomers. And I don't know, you know, the dates on that, but you're the largest generation. And so you have this ability. And sadly to say, we are known as the generation that rebelled the most. And you don't want to paint any generation with one broad stroke, but it seems to adapt well when you look back at the 60s and 70s and what we did. And then we have, behind that, my kids' generation called the busters. So you have a boom, and then you have a bust.